And everyone's dreading that 21 day interval because that is when this happens.
For decades, cattle producers have seen this pattern. Calves will look good right after weaning or shipping, and then about 3 weeks later, things really start to unravel.
When the immune system is scavenging this blood sugar, we barely get through maintenance. And now we're into no gain or even possibly some kind of loss.
Today we dig into this 21-day cortisol surge in cattle, why it's happening, how it traces all the way back to animals' evolutionary biology, and why that stress response is shutting down weight gain and setting the stage for sickness. We'll also talk about management decisions that may actually make that surge worse. Dr. Blaine Ellison with Applied Biotechnologies joins us to walk through the biology, what's available to short-circuit this cortisol surge, and what producers might consider doing differently. That's on this episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Today we're addressing a known issue we've all dealt with as ranchers. Hi everyone, Justin Mills here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. Good to have you with us on our program today, as you heard there in the opening, talking about this 21-day cortisol surge. And I think every one of us can say, hey man, we have been there when it comes to dealing with those cattle that just seem doing like they're doing everything right, and then all of a sudden we have to deal with that sickness. So we're going to be talking about that. We're going to get to that in just a moment, but good to have you on our program. If you missed something, you want to go back and listen to the program, you can find all of our shows through our podcast site, or if you have a preferred podcast provider, you can do it there as well, workinranchradio.com. By the way, if you're listening on a podcast of some sort, be sure to leave us a rating or a review. We sure do appreciate that, and I think that also helps other folks as they're out there searching and looking for shows and maybe come across a show that has a lot of reviews and ratings on it. Might be something that they find valuable as well. By the way, the Working Ranch magazine, the latest issue is out. If you haven't had that opportunity to do that, we've got a lot of great production sales still that will be taking place this year. If you want to see a calendar of all of those that are taking place all across the country, you can check that out. And of course, as always, the Working Ranch magazine is one of the country's leading publications out there with stories, articles, issues that are extremely relevant to all of us as ranchers. So check it out. If you don't have a subscription, you can go to workingranchmag.com and you can get started today, or stop by your local Tractor Supply store and pick one up right off the shelf there as well. Be sure to tune in later on in the show. Meteorologist Don Day will be in as we take a look at our long-range weather. Let's turn towards our subject here today, and joining us on the program is Dr. Blaine Ellison. He is the owner and CEO of Applied Biotechnologies, Inc. And Dr. Ellison, good to have you here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Hey, glad to join you today.
So as ranchers, we all are very aware that one of the things that we're trying to curb in any of our cattle at any given time is stress. And it starts either with whether we're staying here on the ranch and it's our handling technologies, which we may talk about here later on, but it's down to when we get to those crucial times, whether it's weaning, whether it's putting cattle on feed or various things like that. And, you know, one of the things we're always fighting in that is respiratory disease. And the thing that I want to hit on first, and we're going to go through this here strategically today, is talking about cortisol. And I want you to explain, what does cortisol actually have to do in this entire process?
So cortisol became a thing in evolution for fight or flight. Be very transient. You know, either you fought the lion or you fought the wolf or you ran away, right? So that was a sudden stress, and it resolved itself one way or the other. But over time, this ancient animal, which we'll get to in a bit, it elongated into a 21-day cycle. So what happens is you have a repetitive cell signaling circle going on. And so instead of just being an hour or two and like getting that problem dealt with, it became a long-term thing for the survival with infirmities. And that's the problem we have when we cause these stresses, like we were talking about there briefly, for weaning, trucking, grouping, new pens, new rations. All that causes this elongated cortisol surge, and it's hard for us to find a sick animal because for millennia they've evolved this elongated fight or flight situation, and so it's not really our fault. It's not really lack of animal husbandry knowledge. It's just we're fighting a pretty well fine-tuned perfection. And it's in all beef and dairy cattle.
So you talked about the 21-day cortisol surge in that, and that's pretty consistent, really. When you look at that around any operation, we've weaned calves before. We don't do a lot of feeding cattle and background in cattle, but we've weaned, and man, it just seems like we get into that time frame, and it's just like clockwork, isn't it?
You can almost set your watch to it. And what happens is the cell signaling apparatus, it's kind of like a phonograph record where the needle got stuck in a scratch and keeps going and going. And the fatigue of that system takes about 21 days. And so that's when the SHOT Show usually starts, right?
Yep.
And we hear that from our customers all the time that, it looks really good for the first week, maybe 10 days, maybe you had one or two animals that might have come inbound that had a jump start on being sick. You treated them, but then there's this calm before the storm, and everyone's dreading that 21 day interval because that is when this happens.
Yeah.
So if we can do things that would peel the onion skin off, to so to speak, and let us find those animals in a more timely manner when they're not really sick, they're going to be the guys who are sick and potentially fill a hole of dead animals. 21 days, we're much better off. We have maybe one treatment, not have as many repeat pulls, and maybe get some weight gain out of these guys in that first 21 to 28 days.
Yeah. So with that in mind, as you talk about that time frame of that 21 to 28 day period, I find that's interesting because that's a similarity that we see, for example, we're told, when we wean or when cattle hit the feed yard, it's that first 21 days, there's really not a lot of gains in there. And that's going to be tied, I'm assuming, directly to what we're talking about here, whether it's weight gains hitting the feed yard or weaning, or the stress after working them. And when you decide to wean and those shots and all that is going to correlate right back to this, isn't it?
No, absolutely. And the second thing that happens, if cortisol for 21 days wasn't bad enough, that's suppressing immune function, and it's hiding these animals from us finding them, the ones that need help. What happens is our immune system changes over from using lipid metabolism, which is the normal default for a ruminant. It changes over to using blood sugar. And in ancient times, that made a lot of sense because cortisol is good for blood sugar. It encourages blood sugar because we're going to fight or run away, right? Our muscle's going to need some extra nutrient. But when we get the immune system put over to using blood sugar, now we don't have any nutrients that the animal would allocate to gain. And so the animal, went through a checklist. Well, maintenance is first, right? Well, after maintenance, then we're going to gain second. And then, repro, steps farther down the line. But when the immune system is scavenging this blood sugar, we barely get through maintenance. And now we're into no gain or even possibly some kind of loss, backing up. And it is that simple. If we can change this cortisol surge and preempt it, short circuit this cell signaling and knock the immune system back onto where it's meant to be with lipid metabolism, then we have our blood sugar back and now we're gaining weight. Because that animal on its cow or before it came through channels was gaining at some good level. And that's why we felt good about weaning them or felt good about buying that lot of cattle. And now magically the next day they're here at our place, they're stressed or they're stressed when they got pulled off their cows. Now they're not gaining. Okay, same animal, same thing walking around, but now magically there's this other thing going on. And we've seen it so typically for 40 years that now that's become our normal.
Yeah.
Okay, because 60 days from now, we're going to be gaining at 3 or 4 pounds a day, right? And how can that be the same animal? How can the first 21 to 28 days be no gain and call that normal? And now and before that, the day or two before that, they were gaining. Then we're not gaining. And now we got the 60 days and we're gaining. And so what we're missing is this 21 to 28 day thing, and it goes back to this cortisol and immune system cycle.
I think for a lot of us as ranchers or as feeders, boy, we can really see that 21 to 28 day period where we're losing a lot of money in our industry by that.
The other thing if that isn't enough bad news, right, on the menu, the animal now is at a smaller size, right? So at a 3-4 weight, maybe out to 5 weight animal, the metabolic component that we feed for every day isn't as much. And so those gains are more efficient.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now if we wait until those animals are 6, 7 weights, and we're thinking we're going to catch up from that first 21 to 28 days, well, now there's a much larger component of metabolic need. And so that becomes a less efficient feed to gain ratio. And so this really is a bad deal for the industry, you know, that we're walking away from the most efficient time to gain when they're in these smaller weights. Their genetics is looking to have them frame and grow. And yet we're giving up on that 21 to 28 days, like until now.
Yeah. Dr. Ellison, we're heading into a time right now where we're going to see a lot of cattle going to grass. And then later on, we're going to see cattle coming off of grass or calves being weaned or headed, you know, later in the fall of the year. And so when we look at that, you'd already talked about some of the events that can trigger this, but just by and large, just run through that list one more time. And then after we do that, we'll go to break and start talking about the biology behind all this. But just in general, some of the events that can trigger all of this.
Okay, we'll kind of go in order. So it's weaning, it's trucking, weaning and trucking. That's like a double pancake, right, at IHOP. So then we group them. Then we change diets on them. We pen them up, which is not a quite normal situation for them. And then we work them. So we're looking at castration, implanting, vaccinating, which, again, you know, when you read that insert on your vaccine, it doesn't say for maximal response, please vaccinate only during the height of your cortisol surge stress, right? But that's what we tend to do. Mm-hmm. And I get the labor thing. I mean, I understand all that, but that is not the most effective time to be doing those kind of strategies. So every one of these things we're doing, including the host of things going through the chute, is like taking a wiffle ball bat and beating on the hornet's nest. If we weaned them and they got trucked, or we moved them to a new facility, and then we're going to work them, and we're going to castrate, implant, vaccinate, worm, all this stuff. Can't hardly hold that many wiffle ball bats, can you? Mm-hmm. So like we're really smacking that cortisol stress hornet nest, and not one hornet comes out. They all come out, right? So this isn't a dimmer switch kind of deal. This is on or off. The animal's got no control over this. And so when we're thinking about when might be the best time to do some of these strategies, and I think we're going to talk about some of the symptoms, it might be better if we spread some of this out, you know, instead of putting it all on them at once, at least in my mind. And, you know, it's easy to be critical, and, you know, being a science guy as a veterinarian for all these years, you go, well, that doesn't make any sense. But the reason this has happened in our industry is that our veterinarians, our consultants, our guys who own the animals are desperate, because a lot of these protocols haven't worked, or they haven't worked for long. And so we go with metaphylaxis, you know, or we give them all antibiotic shots coming in, or, you know, we vaccinate them right away when that really isn't going to give us any help for 3 to 4 weeks, really. And yet we're doing that on entry because we think they're not going to be healthy in this next interval if we didn't get that done. Mm-hmm. But we're doing that. We're doing all these things because nothing has ever worked, and we're kind of frantic and desperate. And that's why these last 5 years in the private sector, I went into researching this pinch point and then trying to find the solution to that.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Ellison, let's take a break. We've set this up. We've definitely identified, I think, for a lot of us as ranchers or as feedlot folks or folks in the industry. Now let's talk about the biology behind it. We're going to take a break, and when we do that, we're going to talk about how this dates back to the ancient cow, goes clear back to even before we even hardly recognize them as what we see today. But we're going to talk about that when we come back, okay?
Are you disappointed with weaning weight gains that don't seem to keep up with the increase in bull prices? Try capitalizing on the muscle, growth, and efficiency of Limousine and LimFlex hybrids. Whether you sell calves at weaning or retain ownership through the feed yard, the extra muscling and performance of Limousine cross calves will add pounds to your pay weight and dollars to your bottom line. In fact, genetic trends for weaning weight EPDs in Limousine cattle document an increase of nearly 25 pounds over the last 10 years. Limousine and LimFlex deliver dollars to your bottom line. Limousine today, profit tomorrow.
All right, Dr. Ellison, let's get into the biology behind the cortisol surge that we see in cattle. And as you have talked about, it dates clear back to long before what we see as our domestic cow that we've got today. Similar DNA, but it goes clear back to really an ancient cow of some sort.
That's correct. It goes all the way back to the megafauna, which, not to get too geeky, but that's when we had more oxygen in the atmosphere, and every animal was getting bigger. We had woolly mammoth, we had giant sloths, giant bears. Well, the ruminant candidate for this race was the ancient auroch. And this animal was 7 feet at the shoulder, weighed 3,000 pounds. Think about 1.5x buffalo.
Okay.
From today. And so their prowess, their athletic ability was really amazing. They feared nothing. If they saw an ancient predator or an ancient human, they're ready to take that on in a heartbeat, right? So unfortunately, this demeanor carried over to each other. So when they had a herd member that was feeling kind of sick, they would just push that animal to the back of the herd, and then the ancient lion, saber-toothed wolf, whatever, would take care of that, cure them, right? So over the millennia, that was not a winning strategy. And so that's how this started out initially, was this fight-or-flight transient cortisol surge became an elongated 21-day procedure. And so that changed the cell signaling mechanism and how that worked in the animal. And then, like we talked a little bit before, the immune function also toggles over from using the fat metabolism, the ketone bodies, like a normal ruminant always does, and it toggles over to using blood sugar, which made a lot of sense for that animal because there was a lot of blood sugar running around when you're on a 21-day cortisol surge binge, right?
Yeah.
But today we want them to milk. We want them to make lean tissue for us in the beef side. And we've made this animal more and more of an athletic animal, and we're hitting this glass ceiling. Maybe 100 years ago that didn't matter. But today, with what we're expecting of these animals in our industry, this has really become an impediment to what goes on. So those ancient guys, they must have gone out in the dead of night and taken baby ones, because I can't believe 20 guys with sharp sticks we're going to get this done, put a couple of these inside a fence and go, well, mission done for today. We'll come back, start working on this breeding program tomorrow, right? So, we made all these animals, all these beef and dairy breeds, all came from this ancient progenitor stock. And there's a lot of good things that came from that, a lot of robust traits, a lot of good immune system, but this thing came along with it. And this is right in the genetics, right next to the other traits we need. So breeding it out of these animals is not a possibility. So genomics is not going to be our path forward, trying to dilute this, because every time we try to dilute this ancient thing, it's so embedded in them that now we're walking away from rate of gain. We're walking away from other productive traits that we're looking for in our breeds of animal. Okay, so we need to deal with it. We need to recognize it. We need to understand it. Everybody talks about cortisol surge, but nobody has any flippant idea what it is or where it came from. So that was the first step, is you got to figure out what the pinch point is, and you got to know where you've been before you know where you're going. And that's what the last 5 years have been in my life.
Yeah. So with that, we've got that, and it's embedded in the DNA of a cow, essentially, right? Is what you're saying?
Yes, it's part and parcel of the animal when it's born.
And so with that, now we can understand and see, okay, here's then what you talked about in that first segment. And, when we see cattle in that 21 to 28 days, literally anything that we push towards them is not going towards any ounce of growth at all.
Right. So the signs that we see in peer review is actually correlated these directly, like 100% to the cortisol surge. But we get vocalization, right? We pull them off their cows and we're bawling for some period of time, right? Now, as a normal ruminant, that's not a good behavior, right? You're not wanting to be there calling the predator, say, hey, I'm over here as a young baby ruminant. But we have this vocalization. We have endless energy of walking the perimeters of our pen area. You're just like an energized bunny walking around. We look to be skittish or flighty because back in the ancient times when they push you to the back, it might be good to have an extra step to steal second against the saber tooth or the wolf, right? So they don't let you get as close. This cortisol surge doesn't let them get as close to them before they're off or they're running away. And we interpret that as skittish or flighty, but funny, 60 days from now, we're not skittish or flighty anymore, are we?
Mm-mm.
Okay, because that's not part of their normal personality. And yet we're saying that this is normal behavior in the first 21 to 28 days, but then magically 60 days from now is their real normal behavior. Well, we can't have real normal behavior on both sides of that, right? Because they're so diametrically opposed. And so I think if we recognize that these are symptoms of the cortisol surge and not their true personality traits, they're meant to be docile and gentle, like when they were on their cows, right? They're not meant to be like running all over the place, jumping up, trying to jump over walls, trying to barge through the head catch and chutes. All these things they've studied and assigned, chute scores, pen scores, social flight distancing, the amount of energy they walk and the amount that they vocalize. All those things are 100% correlated to the cortisol surge.
Okay.
So when we look over the fence, here's group cattle, and we either took them off their cows, they come inbound from, through channels, and we're seeing bawling, we're seeing like running around, we're seeing endless walking and not really caring about the feed in the bunk. Okay. We don't need to send samples to the lab to know that they're at their max cortisol surge, because those are the symptoms. Mm-hmm. Those are the signs. So when we see that going on, it might be better not to do other things that are going to take another wiffle ball bat and smack the hornet nest. Maybe it's better to vaccinate week 2. Maybe it's better to process doing what other things we might be doing with vaccines or worming or, those kind of things. Maybe wait until it settles down a bit. Maybe wait till we have the cortisol surge thing under control. Maybe take some kind of a technology that short circuits this cell signaling. And so we don't have to be lab scientists to be able to make assessments of these groups on the back of a napkin looking over the gate. The animals are there telling us that. And if we understand these signals and understand that, by the way, when we're getting these signals, how much weight are we gaining? We're gaining 0, right? Because the immune system is scavenging all of the blood glucose from an inappropriate reset due to part of this cortisol surge. So that's when this is happening. When any of these things are happening, they keep happening, be guaranteed that you're not getting much over the scales. Those kind of cattle, 14 days, you don't get a lot. You're not getting a lot, because the other side of that is using this blood glucose inappropriately.
Yeah. Dr. Ellison, let's take a break here. And when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about some management as we start taking our conversation into, what can we as producers do differently to handle this. We'll be back.
Imagine keeping your cattle exactly where you want them, while being able to tap into insights powered by a collar and an app. No Fence is the world's first virtual fencing system for grazing livestock. From the palm of your hand and delivered with GPS technology, you can set and move pasture boundaries, gain insight into grazing patterns, receive reduced animal activity alerts, and more. No wires, no posts, just empowered grazing that supports healthier land and your herd goals. 10,000 plus producers globally already trust No Fence. Explore the possibilities at nofence.com.
Your herd needs protein. When the seasons shift, so do your herd's protein needs. SmartLick protein tubs deliver consistent nutrition that drives performance, helping cattle make the most of available forages, maintain condition and power through winter efficiently, giving you peace of mind. Feed smarter, not harder. Go to smartlick.com. That's smartlic.com to find your dealer.
All right, Dr. Ellison, as we talked about in the last segment, the fact that burning glucose for immune activity and how that's affecting the performance for these animals. And you'd also identified, I think it was in the first segment, you said, man, we're at a time frame for these cattle when they could be the most productive time for these animals at the weight that they're at when we're starting to talk about these younger animals. And so when we look at this and understanding, okay, we've got an issue with the cortisol surge that's creating a ceiling that we can't get through with performance on these animals. And looking at that, and I know for a lot of times when you've got cattle that are coming into feedlot, there's a lot of times where we talk about, well, it's really a lot of a focus more on nutrition, but it sounds like it's more of a metabolic physiology in this than it is anything. So let's talk about, from that standpoint, what we're seeing in management today that really isn't affecting the cortisol issue that we're dealing with.
Sure. I guess in my background, I started being a nutritionist in 1989. So that's going to be a long time in the rearview mirror by now. But I learned it from the guys who wrote the original model. So I've got a lot of insight into what causes frame growth and what doesn't cause frame growth. So these facilities are probably weighing the animals inbound or when they're weaned off the cows, and they're weighing them maybe at 14 or 28 days or whatever. And they're finding that they're not getting the kind of gains that they would envision, and maybe no gains. Okay, so we have a meeting with our nutrition advisor, and we're scratching our head because we're not getting any weight on this receiver diet, and yet his diets for us out there at 60 days, cattle are rocking along at 3-4 pounds of gain. So how does that happen? How's my nutritionist a moron on day 1 and he's Einstein on day 60, right? And you laugh, but been there, done that. Okay, so what we do is we decide, well, they're not gaining weight, so what do we need to do? We need to step on the gas and make a more energy-dense diet. Okay, the reason these diets were called receiver diets in the first place, they were made to give us a soft landing. They're going to have adequate energy, but they're not going to be pushing the animal, going to give them a chance to get grounded in their new management style. Okay, so when we give them these higher diets, because we misdiagnose why they aren't gaining, because again, not gaining because we're using the blood sugar from this ancient stress mechanism, then we're going to be dancing with the devil. We're going to be walking kind of close to an acidotic type diet, right? So that's not helping immune function either, right? So got cortisol surge not helping immune function. We're having these higher energy diets not helping us. But the most tragic part, I think, is that when we increase the energy ratios in these diets and we unbalance protein to energy ratio as it's coming off the rumen complex, we're telling that animal metabolically, please don't frame out, please just gain, right? And so we confuse the two words, growth and gain, because they both start with the letter G, right? So, that gets a little confusing, but they're radically different, right? Like, at my tender age, I probably am not growing anymore. If anything happens, it's definitely on the gain side, right? So these animals are in their perfect time frame, like we discussed, because they're low maintenance, because they're not the high body weights yet, and they got a lot of growth hormone in them, and those animals are ready to do the framing that they were genetically envisioned to have. Okay, so if we walk away from some of that, if we suppress that or we miniaturize that, if you look out to the far end of this system, a year from now, and the problem is the cause and the effect are not right next to each other like in cattle often are. So you get out to the far end and we're having closeouts, especially on female cattle, where they're dropping back to 2% intakes and they're maybe 200 to 300 pounds lighter, and our cutout ratios are dropping down to 60 or maybe even slightly lower than 60. And the reason for this is we didn't volumetrically grow that frame in the time frame it was meant to happen because we misdiagnosed and we encouraged our nutrition advisors to up the energy on our receiver diets, so they were no longer diets that were supporting these kind of frame growth. Mm-hmm. And that's hurting us on that end of the deal too. I mean, if you could get an extra 100, 200 pounds on each of these female cattle going to market, if you've noticed that kind of trend, that's why it's happening. So why don't we do something about the cortisol and the immune system scavenging of blood sugar and maybe have these more healthy receiver diets, which we've envisioned. That's why we started having them. Mm-hmm. And I think everything might work along a little more efficiently and be a little more economic for us in the end.
Yeah. Okay. Let's start moving into what we as producers can do. And I think we're going to have to, and I want to leave plenty of time for that because I've got lots of questions on that. I think you've done a really good job of outlining the situation that we have in our industry in this. So now I know for a lot of us, we're saying, okay, so how do we do this going forward? For example, let's just go through the time frame that we're dealing with right now. we're at a time where a lot of cattle are going to be headed to grass. There's going to be stress points in those, and they're not necessarily going to be in pens where you can go gather them up or do anything like that. But from a standpoint of that and cattle that are going to be pushing and moving into grass here in the next few months to 3 months out, what are you advising for producers to do differently?
All right. So obviously, like the end of this story was invention of a product that short-circuited the cortisol surge, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a 1/10 pound feed rate. Okay, so being an old nutritionist, it's a 1/10 feed rate. It was formulated to do what it does, but not to disrupt any kind of ration strategy or a lack of ration strategy. So it could either go into your, 10th pound feed rate. It could almost go in a guy's free choice mineral, or if you're fence line feeding it all. But the first 21 days to do this for the animal, because it turns out when you study cell surface antigens, which that's a mouthful, but if you study cell surface antigens, there's a chronicity to it. If we wait too long from the time that we stimulate this stress event, if we wait too long, internal functions of the cells get imprinted and we can't do anything about it then. And so we need to start on this like first day, right? So we need to be, even ideally, if it was on creep feed in calves that are coming off cows, have it on their creep feed for a few days so we didn't even let it ever get started. Mm-hmm. We duct tape the end of the hornet's nest so they're not even going to come out of there when we get out the wiffle ball bat, and then finish off in that first stretch. And so the incentive to figure out how to do something here is 21 days of 3 pounds of weight a day at whatever you're assigning that as a market price, as a feeder animal or as something that we aren't going to try and feed that weight back onto that we miss later on when maintenance energies are that much higher. So that's part of the challenge. It can't be much easier than it has to get in their mouth, right? Mm-hmm. But we don't have to put them, we don't have to work them, we don't put them through shoes, we don't have to stress them in any way. We just got to get this in their mouth for the first 21 days.
All right, let's take a quick break because I want to continue on this about what we can do differently. And I think one of the things I want to bring up too in our next segment is, because I know there's folks listening say, okay, well, you're just providing another product in our industry, another input cost to me as a rancher. But I would think, I know in some of the research that I've read that you have written out there too, is I think as ranchers, there's a component that also comes into this about low stress handling. And I want to just have you touch on that real quick as well when we come back here in this next segment. All right.
Horn flies stressing your cattle? Make fly control one and done with Alticid IGR XRB. Alticid IGR XRB delivers season-long horn fly control from a single application bolus, providing up to 195 days of relief regardless of mineral consumption or location. It breaks the horn fly life cycle with no impact on beneficial insects, giving you flexible, consistent control. Learn more at cargillanimalnutrition.com/Alticid bolus.
Capitalize on crossbreeding with Gelbvieh and Balancer bulls. Raise replacement females with added fertility, increased longevity, and greater productivity. Gelbvieh and Balancer influence females wean more pounds of calf per cow exposed. In the feed yard, Balancer influenced cattle offer increased performance, improved feed efficiency, and have excellent carcass merit. Balancers add the pounds, make the grade, and deliver the value. This year, make your crossbreeding count with Gelbvieh and Balancer genetics.
All right, Dr. Blaine Ellison is my guest today with Applied Technologies, Inc. And Dr. Ellison, as we've identified the cortisol issue in our industry and just that surge that takes place in these animals that causes really a lot of the costs that we're seeing in terms of treatment costs for ranchers or feedlots or folks when cattle get sick because of all of this. You had talked about in the first segment just things that we could potentially maybe there's some things we could be doing a little bit differently. As we closed out the last segment, I said, okay, we got cattle hitting grass here anytime in these next few months. And how can we prep this and how can we handle this? Let's get down to specifically as well, going into specific things that we could be doing differently. We talked about, you said at branding time, we're doing a lot of this. There's a lot of stress in that animal at that point in time. What's kind of your thoughts in this? And I know you're cautious to just armchair quarterback everything. At the same time, though, from your perspective, perspective, doing an awful lot of research these last 5 years on this for ranchers. And from now until December of this next year, we're going to have new calves on the ground. We're going to be branding calves. We're going to be preconditioning calves. We're going to be sorting calves. We're going to be sending calves off. We got a lot of work going on. So from your perspective, what's your thoughts that how we could be handling things a little bit different to keep this cortisol surge from happening?
Sure. One of them is stacking vaccines. Okay, so like we're going to give them a respiratory vaccine with both viruses and bacteria. We're going to give them probably a Clostridium vaccine. Okay, those two vaccines are two of the most wicked vaccines as far as toxins go. So those bacteria are dangerous. That's why we've made vaccines. Okay, so when this animal was a deer out in the woods where we put it inside the fence, they would maybe get one antigen or maybe at most two. Mm-hmm. Okay, so here we're talking about maybe 14, 15 antigens. Shooting them on each side of the neck does not count as spreading out your vaccines because they're still in the animal. Mm-hmm. Okay, the problem is that the animal developed to deal with these toxins when they ate them, okay, because that's how they would go. They would eat these, and then the rumen would denature most of them, which is why we can feed cattle things you'd never even think about feeding a pig or a chicken, right, because they don't have a rumen. Okay, so when we shoot a vaccine into them parenterally, which means outside the mouth, then we've got toxins circulating in the body, but now my rumen is of zero value, right? So that's why we stall out. Okay, so we're going to stall out for a week, depending on how much we're stacking these toxic vaccines. That can be an issue for longer, but that's what's causing the animal the doldrums. Is that we're maybe overloading. So maybe we don't vaccinate them with both of those. I know a lot of guys are worried about Clostridium at the far end when we're doing the heavy feeding to finish them out. Well, if you look at Clostridium vaccines, the antigenicity or the amount of protection they provide is 6 to 8 months, even with a booster. I mean, that's how it is. They need to be maybe given at a later date altogether so that their maximal protection is during that time frame when we're going to be worried about Clostridium sudden death in these animals. A lot of times that isn't at the start. That's happening out there later on, and we're just doing it now for that rainy day 7, 8 months from now when that vaccination strategy is about at its end anyway. And so maybe, we give them the vaccines for respiratory because that's immediate. We're going to need that in the next 3 or 4 weeks. But, don't think that these vaccines are there for today. Those vaccines aren't keeping you from dying today. Those vaccines are keeping you from having problems a month from now. Okay. And so we shouldn't be thinking of them as the life preserver for the drowning calf, now, because that's not science. Mm-hmm. I know we've evolved into some of these protocols because of what our desperation level has been. But, if we sprinkle a little science in there, if maybe we don't think outside the box, but at least open the lid and look out over the flap, and just ponder the possibility that there is some other way to be getting this done, that might be helpful for a guy, might be helpful. And we crowd them up and we put them in new social situations. That's incredibly impactful. And we kind of just blow that off, but put them together where they're not going to get away from each other and they're going to deal with each other. Now it's like the bully on the playground, right? There's always going to be that one. If you take that one out, the next one steps up. I mean, it's always going to happen. Mm-hmm. So that's inevitable. Those kind of stresses we have to deal with, but dealing with them and knowing that there maybe is something to do is helpful. Okay, so cortisol surge. Okay, if we look at changing what this is doing to the animal. Okay, the opposite of cortisol surge is not sedation. Okay, the opposite of cortisol surge is interrupting this cell signaling pathway, getting them off this merry-go-round, get them off this roller coaster, and put them back into normal animal behavior and normal animal metabolic activity. That's the goal. Mm-hmm. That's the difference between cortisol surge and not having cortisol surge. And, I can't guarantee that you're going to have Skittles and unicorns over your facility every day, but we might be able to change the forecast to partly sunny, at least, you're right. Going to at least move in the direction where this gets to be more profitable, more fun for people because we understand these rules and we're going to do things that make that happen. So Temple Grandin, she was a forefront of this stuff back in the 80s. And certainly we didn't know about cortisol surge or cell signaling, any of that back then. But she made a lot of inroads for our industry on animal behavior, animal handling, back when they were out there in the woods before we locked them up, started like having problems with them.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that leads me to this question, because I had mentioned that we were going to talk about this. And I think the thing that I want to make sure that folks understand here too is, yes, you've identified a product that you have that can short circuit this cortisol surge, but that doesn't mean we just still ram and jam livestock. I think there's still always a place that we have to, first and foremost, stockmanship is first and foremost in all of this.
Absolutely. And when you look at the symptoms of these animals, you put them together, or you get some animals that the first time they saw a human was they got taken off their cow and put in a trailer, and those guys are climbing walls. So, if we're really vocalizing, we're really climbing walls, we're running away from the chute. We want to be the last guy in the chute. Well, a lot of the research, anybody who's been on the business end of chutes didn't need a study at the university to tell you that those last few that absolutely don't want to go in are the highest jazzed up cortisol animals, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that's what turns out in the study. Imagine that. And so when you have that kind of activity going on in the cattle, that's not meant to be a sports challenge. That's meant to be like, maybe tap the brakes. Maybe today isn't the day. We got a weather event coming up. Maybe we don't want to schedule our working the cattle right on the back of a late snow, early snow, whatever's happening. But, sometimes those things are coming, and maybe we schedule these events, wean them off. And if they are going to hit trailers or trucks later on, that is where some of this preconditioning concept came from. Because, let them go over that stress of weaning before we put them on the trailer, because, the studies show that too. You read those studies, and the worst two things we can do is wean them and put them on a trailer together. Weaning and trucking together is a bigger cortisol event than any of these other things looked at individually.
A quick question on that is a cortisol level, does it max out at a certain amount, or as you said there, the worst thing we can do is wean a calf and throw them on a truck? I guess my thought a little bit in some of this is, if we're going to do an activity that's going to raise the cortisol level, do we just do it all at one time?
Well, that's what we're doing now. So what are they, when you say something that's obvious and sarcastic, sometimes people go, oh, yeah, I guess maybe we are doing that. Well, so what happens is, that is what we're pretty much doing right now, right? And I get it. This thing about labor and that kind of stuff, those are real. And, people that turn off because of that, I get that. But that isn't changing the rules of the animal. If we don't like the rules of the animal, maybe learn the rules of the animal. We work with that, and that makes us a more profitable person and a less frustrated person. And so some of this, I think, goes back to that. And unfortunately, like we mentioned before, genetics is not the way forward out of this, because the genetics are so closely linked to these ancient traits. The reason why we chose this animal to be our beef and dairy animals was because these traits were so closely related to the robustness of that ancient animal.
Yeah.
So we just got to understand that.
Dr. Ellison, just a real quick question, and I had this written down, and I don't mean to go back to something you mentioned before, but I do want to just clarify. When you talked about branding time, and it's not necessarily that you're saying we don't give those vaccinations, but we maybe space them out. Is that, just kind of give me a short answer on that.
Yeah. Like the bacteria and the respiratory vaccines have some severe endotoxins. Clostridiums kill with their toxins. So if we use those two vaccines together, we are stacking it up and we're causing more stress. And possibly if you examine why we're giving Clostridium or what weight range of animals we usually have issues with, you might not even need to do those in that same time frame. It might be an inappropriate time frame, might be a waste of vaccination protection when that animal isn't even going to be exposed to that kind of stress. So out there, maybe a 7, 8, 9 weight animal.
Sure.
So maybe a 3, 4, 5 weight animal, and we know that that's only going to last for 6 to 8 months. So maybe that's a vaccine better given later. Naturally, better use of our vaccine dollars, better use of protection for the animal, and less stacking of these vaccines.
Yeah. All right, 2 more questions. One, what's the future? I know we talked a little bit at break about some things that's coming down that you're looking at with this, but tell me the future of what you're doing here.
Okay, so what we're working on now is we're working with universities. We have a couple of universities that have agreed to have meetings with us here in the spring about using our product potentially as a research tool, not to study the product itself, but to use it to shut off this cortisol and preserve blood glucose so that we're not using other tools like meloxicam, which is like a synthetic aspirin, which does spare some of the glucose, but it does it by suppressing immune function. Okay, so we don't want to suppress immune function and not get good results on our BRD research, because BRD is definitely triggered by this stress situation. Cortisol hurts the immune system. The system's not working exactly right because it's on glucose instead of on its fat stores. And what we've seen is up to 3/4 less antibiotic therapy in 4 years. Our 4-year average is about 3/4 less antibiotic shots given to animals. And certainly, I don't think antibiotics are going to lose their spot. We're always going to need antibiotics. We're always going to need vaccinations. I'm certainly not a non-vaxxer, but let's use them maybe in a strategic way so that we get the best use of those dollars.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Ellison, real quick, your guys' website, we've talked a little bit about the QFA today here, a little bit, that product, but also I know you have iGuard, which is a pink eye product out there as well. But real quick, your website, if folks are interested in doing a little more research on their own.
Applied-biotechnologies.com. And you can write me an email through that website, and I respond pretty quick. So I've got a lot of windshield time, do a lot of returning calls. I do have a Florida cell phone number, but that's an artifact of 25 years as a large dairy nutritionist in Central Florida.
All right. Well, Dr. Ellison, before you go, I've been doing this with our guests here. Just a final comment that's really unrelated to our subject that we talked about here today, but just from one person to the next, just maybe a nugget of advice that you would give folks listening to the show here today.
So, almost all the stuff that we've talked about during these segments wasn't even known when the ink was drying on my vet degree. And I think what people need to understand is that your degree is the start, not the end. Okay. You gotta keep enhancing your knowledge. Surround yourself with people that are knowledgeable. Nobody knows everything, that's for sure. And reach out to other people who already know a bunch of other stuff in other areas, and they reach out to you.
Yeah, very good. Well, Dr. Ellison, good to have you here today. Good discussion, very eye-opening to just hear that perspective and get a really good understanding of really what all of us in the cattle industry have dealt with and are dealing with and will be dealing with in this coming year as well. And I think it's a good time to kind of get a perspective on it that may help us eliminate some costs from each of our ranching operations. So thank you for joining us here today.
And thanks for having me. I really valued the opportunity, and it's a humbling feeling to get on a show like yours and maybe share some insights for people. Maybe it'll help them going forward.
You bet. All right. Thank you. And our guest joining us on the program today, Dr. Blaine Ellison. He is the owner, CEO of Applied Biotechnologies, Inc. And of course, their website, as we talked about a bit ago, was applied-biotechnologies.com is the website if you want to look at more information, some of the research, the studies that they've done, as we talked a little bit about the cortisol levels, the product that they have, QAF. Also, there's a product, and we probably need to have him back on to talk a little bit about this in regard to pink eye. That's called iGuard. If you want to find out more information about all of those, you can go to their website at applied-biotechnologies.com. We're going to take a look at our long-range weather coming up next.
Fascinated by our wild weather? Now you can learn, appreciate, and understand the weather in your own backyard with the new Tropo Rain Gauge. Having achieved the highest rating of any product reviewed by the WeatherStationExperts.com, the Tropo boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the 100th of an inch. Visit MeasureRain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY. That's RAINDAY for free shipping and 10% off. Go to MeasureRain.com.
And joining us now with a look at our long-range weather is meteorologist Don Day. And Don, we're here into the middle of March, and as we were talking before we started, yet another big storm hitting the Midwest and the east half of the United States. And you were saying it's kind of unprecedented that we've seen 5 this year?
Yeah. So you hear a lot of times on the news, the polar vortex, the Arctic Express. Polar vortex is what people talk about a lot when we get these big cold outbreaks, and then you get all the winter weather associated with it. And in the normal course of a winter, we'll see some winters where you don't have any. Most of the time you'll get one or two, but this is number 5 and going back to November. So to have these, obviously they cause big impacts. They cause the severe winter conditions in the Midwest that we've seen at times in parts of the Great Lakes and East. But the opposite can happen. So if you're not getting these polar vortexes coming in, you get the opposite weather, which is the warm and dry, which was what we've been seeing in the Western United States and a good part of the West Central U.S. all winter season.
Mm-hmm. So I know looks, as you were saying, it's going to be wet and cold back there, hot and dry in the West. The concern now starting to set in a little bit. Is this dryness going to stay in the West? And kind of one area that was a little bit of concern is that area between I-90 and maybe I-70 corridor through Nebraska, Wyoming, Nebraska, and on in.
Yeah, no, it's a big concern, and the thing is the big picture items that we're looking at still indicate that if we can get rid of these polar vortex situations and we can get rid of these blocking patterns and the illusions and the Greenland blocks, which is what will happen when you get these polar vortex situations, that we should, as we get into late March, April, and May, those areas should get back into precipitation. But seeing is believing. And until that happens, that particular area you mentioned is a big concern. I'm also really concerned about the Southern Rockies, the Central and Southern Rockies, along and south of I-70 to I-40 as well, because the current pattern that's been in place really since November has got to break before they're going to start to get wet again.
Okay, so the billion-dollar question is it gonna?
Well, I will tell you this. It's like, for those of you old enough to remember the Charlie Brown Penix comic strips where Lucy would hold the football for Charlie Brown to kick it and then pull it away at the last minute. That's how the winter has gone for weather forecasters. You think Lucy's maybe going to let Charlie kick it, and then she pulls it away. And the person pulling it away, the football, has been these blocking patterns and these polar vortex situations. Usually, and I'll say usually, not always, when you get into April, May, we don't tend to see those blocking patterns persist or for long because of the changing seasons. And really, that's what we're gunning for now, and that's what we're hoping for. We were hoping March would be a better month, and it has been in some locations. I mean, this past week, we saw some really good moisture in Montana and far northern areas of Wyoming and Idaho and Washington State. But we're going to really have to put a lot of our eggs in the basket for April and May.
All right. Well, Don, appreciate the update, and we'll cross our fingers.
See you then.
All right. And again, that was meteorologist Don Day with a look at our long-range weather. If you want to tune in each and every morning to his daily video podcast, you can go to his website at dayweather.com, and there's a link to his YouTube channel. Today's long-range weather brought to you by long-range epinephrine with 150 days of parasite control in just one single dose. To find out more, you can go to their website at longrangedewormer.com. Want to again thank you for joining us on this weekend's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show. As I said before, all of our programs you can be found by going to our podcast site at workingranchradio.com, or you can also find it on your preferred podcast provider. And did want to point out, last week's show was a show where we unveiled and talked about some new technology that's out there about artificial intelligence changing how embryo transfer works and really revolutionizing that industry in a way of making it definitely more economical or affordable, and knowing that what you're doing there is going to actually be an embryo that takes. And so that's a good show to go back and listen to on last week's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Well, the Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch Magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you can send me an email at justin.workingranch@gmail.com. Thanks for joining us. I'm Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.